Thank you all so much for coming. I'm Chantal. I'm going to start with a brief reading from my novel. I'm calling my novel like a surviving to thriving novel. It is a new kind of survivor narrative, one that I wish that I had had when I was growing up. It features characters who have survived violence, and they have done so with wit and humor and intellectualism, and they are not the dead girls that I grew up reading about when I was younger. They are very much alive. I'm going to read a section of the book that's from a chapter called Bad at Parties. And in this section of the book, my main character, Vivian, she's beginning a flirtation with a married man. And she has decided that he's married to her rival in the book, a woman named Pauline, and she has decided that she's going to attempt to flirt with him by broaching the subject of one of his favorite directors, who is Woody Allen. And by doing this, she will both flirt with the man, Elliot, and she will also demonstrate her intellectual superiority to her rival. Okay. I will also say that this is a work of fiction, and any resemblance to characters living or dead, even if they are named, is just a pure coincidence. Bold move to keep that Woody Allen book in your bathroom, Vivian said to Elliot eventually, trying to lure him into a private conversation. With a bashful smile, he turned toward her. What can I say? He's a genius. Can I ask how you feel as a woman? He said, leaning closer, about the allegations. Vivian laughed and pivoted toward Elliot, pretending to hold a microphone. Well, as a human who cares about women and girls and knows what a predator is, I can say that they aren't allegations, they are facts. And to society, I would say, where were y'all in the 80s? Because this news literally dropped back then, but no one cared about women and girls then. And y'all only care now because being anti-misogyny is cool. But also, none of this changes the fact that another woman is brilliant. And Denise interrupted. I'm sorry, but I just can't. If I ever get tempted to watch anything he makes now, I just remind myself that he molested his daughter. That usually gets rid of my desire to watch Annie Hall or whatever movie you're talking about. Vivian felt her neck getting red. She hadn't wanted this to be a big group sort of conversation. Max said, I've never been invested in Woody Allen, but this does come up for me with David Bowie raping people. Who did David Bowie rape? Vivian asked. A young girl, I think. No one talks about it. It's weird which sexual abusers people latch onto and which people don't. But I do the same thing as Denise. Get tempted to listen to Station, and then think about him raping someone. Christina said, I'm so scared of being caught listening to or watching something by someone who's been canceled that now I just Google everyone first before I consume anything. We need an FDA, but for rapists, Vivian said, to Christina only, and only Christina laughed. Kurt sighed. I just don't care. I don't care what the artist does or doesn't do in his personal life. Once the thing is out there in the world, it's mine. The artist, I can take or leave. Denise turned to face Kurt. But there's money involved. Your consumption is allowing a pedophile to get richer. Don't you see a problem with that? The art and the artist can't be financially separated. I don't care about my money supporting them, Kurt replied, because the issue isn't that abusers are artists. I mean, abusers are everywhere. They do everything for a living. So you find yourself inevitably supporting them. Elliot cleared his throat. For me, it depends what the art is about. If the art is actually about whatever the artist is being accused of, then I can't make the distinction between the art and the artist. So like, I can watch Crimes and Misdemeanors, but can't watch Manhattan. It's too close. Vivian tongued the inside of her cheek as they spoke, different parts of her clamoring for attention. One part happy this conversation was happening, another part inexplicably enraged. She was the one who'd been talking about sexual violence for years when no one else was talking about it, and she had the best opinions on it. She was an expert in these matters. She should be a talking head on TV discussing these matters. She should be writing internet explainers on these matters. And now she's standing at a party, completely unheard, unappreciated, and unrepresented. There was a moment of expectant silence that comes when everyone in a group has given their opinion about a topic, and they all want to be the one to say the next brilliant thing about it. They want to have the one interpretation, the one take that everyone can rally around. Vivian jerked up into this void, dramatically sloshing her drink around in her cup and taking a gulp before speaking. "Look," she said, "pedophiles can make important movies about women." She took a beat. "Another woman is brilliant. Jenna Rollins' performance is legendary, and there just aren't many movies that portray an intellectual woman grappling with the limitations of her own personality. I mean, I'm the most feminist person here," she continued with self-aware vanity, holding her right hand to her chest and making eye contact with each person as if they were the members of some jury. "And my love of that movie doesn't negate my loyalty to the feminist cause. Maligning a pedophile's work product, that's the morally easy thing to do. For me, when we're talking about moral duties, the real test is what you do when you know or suspect that abuse of women or children is going on in your life, in your actual life. I'd like to see the people who refuse to watch Manhattan or The Cosby Show or 2.5 Men reruns actually have their moral construct tested when someone close to them turns out to be an abuser. Because we all know someone who's abusive, whether we're aware of it or not. On the far end," she said, pointing at Pauline, "your father could be out there molesting people." But at the very least, we all know toxic people who must be stopped. Do we stop them, though? I think we fixate on the ethics of aesthetic consumption because it's easier than dealing with the moral trespasses of real life. It's easier to denounce an artwork than a family member, right, or a friend. So ultimately, for me, all this talk about whether we should watch Annie Hall or Dance to Ignition Remix or whatever is a distraction from the larger problem. How do we prevent the mass rape and abuse of women and children? And what do we do with the offenders? It was a solid speech. Very high school oratory, very opening statement, very militaristically vanquishing the enemy. Vivian took a triumphal sip of her drink, surveyed her lands, waited for applause. But she didn't get any. No one knew what to say. She didn't understand what she had done. She had to read their faces. Pauline was looking at Vivian like she was crazy. Denise's face indicated that she was puzzling over Vivian's remarks and couldn't speak until she had a rebuttal. Elliot seemed sympathetic, but perhaps felt it was too soon to express that sympathy. They'd only just met, and Vivian had suggested that his father-in-law could be a pedophile. Max looked like he was watching a reality show where women compete against each other, and one of the women has just come for another of the women in a crossing the line manner that was also true. So while he was slightly disturbed, he was also thinking she's not wrong. She probably shouldn't have mentioned abusers in their lives. Maybe some of the men in the circle were abusers, and maybe some of the women in the circle had been abused, and maybe even one or two of the men in the circle had been abused, or maybe it was just the social taboo against mentioning abuse, but now it appeared that no one wanted to say anything because she had made things too real by going down this road like years ago when she would make things about race around a group of white people before it had become socially acceptable or even cool to make things about race. And now here she was, out there all alone, looking, she felt, like someone who'd been abused as a child. She had outed herself. She felt out of control. Her face was getting red. The sludgy feeling was returning. Could they all see? Pauline spoke first, as if she had to, being a psychologist in the presence of an unstable person. Well, anyway, I'm not sure how we got from Annie Hall to people having abusers in their family and mass rape, she said, looking at Elliot, determinedly not looking at Vivian, but clearly directing the comment toward her. Her quotation marks felt like rubber gloves being used to protect her delicate social ecosystem from Vivian's hazardous concepts. What she was really saying was, this is my birthday party, and I don't want to talk about this stuff. I've high-topped you. High-top is a manner, a psychological manner of describing psychological pathologies. I've high-topped you, and you're mostly a fearful and distressed internalizer with a thought disorder, but you also tend to antagonistically externalize in social situations. In other words, you're creepy, afraid, depressed, and bad at parties. Stop bringing down the mood. I'll end there.
That was so great.
Thank you.
I wanted it to go on. So I'm gonna start out with just kind of the basics. But the book's been out about a week and a half, so I'm hoping many people have read it. But I also understand it hasn't been out a long time. Do you have like a little elevator pitch that you could do for people who haven't necessarily read the book yet, so that everybody's on the same page as to what it's about?
Yeah, for sure. I think I describe Posttraumatic as a darkly funny novel about the psychological and interpersonal aftermath of a trauma. It's written in, and when I say the word trauma, I'm specifically talking about violence experienced in childhood, as well as poverty and neglect. And it's a very episodic book, and it follows my main character through different spheres of her life. So she works as a lawyer at a psychiatric hospital where she's representing indigent people, many of whom are also survivors of trauma. She dates, and we see some of her attachment issues, we might say, that come up in dating. We see her interpersonal relationship with her best friend, Jane, who is also a survivor of violence, and they have a particular cerebral and funny relationship to their own trauma. And after she attends a family reunion that is incredibly stressful, she makes a decision that changes her life, essentially. Was that okay?
Yeah, that was perfect. I was like, yeah, keep on being like, yeah, I know what happens. But all right, well, let me ask you. I think for me, like, the book was sent to me, and like the first thing, I opened the envelope and I saw this cover, and it's a very striking cover. It's a very striking title, and I'm wondering, that's the first thing that people see when they get the book.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the decision process that went into the title?
Yeah, so I wrote this book over a period of 7 or 8 years while I was working as a tenant attorney. And for the longest time, the title was Dark Thoughts. And at about like year 6 or year 7, I don't remember, a reader said, I was expecting the thoughts to be darker. It was such an interesting comment. And so then I was like, oh, these thoughts aren't dark enough? Okay. So then I started kind of brainstorming other titles, and I don't know, Posttraumatic just felt really right to me because I was writing a survivor story that's really focused on the aftermath, and particularly the psychological aftermath of experiencing violence. My book is purposefully not written from the perspective of a child. It doesn't feature very many graphic depictions of abuse. It's just firmly in the after. So I liked the post. I also like the title because my main character, Vivian, thinks that she's over what she has experienced, or she feels very post-trauma. And so I tried to, but it's a difficult title, I think, because it carries a lot. So then with the cover, I felt like we needed to have a contrast between the title, which is incredibly loaded, and which is a diagnostic category, which I am not describing because I am not like just writing like a vivified DSM entry, like what Parallel Sagal talks about in her trauma plot essay. Like, I'm not doing that. So we needed, I felt strongly that we needed a cover that would provide some kind of aesthetic contrast with the title. And so I love this image of this woman who's just like smoking a joint in the bath and like looking at the viewer. I would hope that that contrast between the title and her willfulness, you know, like that's for me, that's what the book is, you know. It's like willfulness in the face of bad things happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting because the word post-traumatic carries all these connotations. It sort of sets all these expectations. And for me, like, one of the things I loved about this book is the way it was constantly breaking expectations. And it sort of taught me to read it as I went through it. And one of the ways that I think it both defies expectations and taught me is that it's really funny. And I think that, like, generally when people think trauma, when they think like capital A abuse, they're not really thinking like, and then hilarity ensues,
right.
You know?
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about what humor does for you, both like as a writer yourself and perhaps what it does for Vivian as a narrator, and whether those two are the same?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think when I was writing this book, I mean, in the early stages of writing it, I was obsessed with stand-up. And I kept asking this question to my friends: who will be the great child abuse comedian of our time? And I really wanted this person to arise and fill a market gap, the market gap of my soul. Because when I was growing up, like, there were all of these like dudes who were making jokes about rape. Like, that was the society that I lived in. Okay, I'm almost 40. And you'd go to these comedy shows and you'd see these dudes and they would be making jokes about rape from a kind of would-be perpetrator perspective. And there was this idea in the culture that making jokes about rape was the most outre thing that you could do if you were a male comedian. And I was just like, no, the most outre thing that you can do is make rape jokes from a victim and survivor perspective. Like, that's the most outre thing that you can do. So who's gonna do that? And who's gonna do that with rape? And who's gonna do that with child abuse? And that person like never showed up. So then I was like, well, I'm just gonna have to be that, like, in my book. And so I make my characters just do kind of stand up for each other about like the abuse that they've experienced. And that felt really like, it felt really powerful to me to do that in the way that like humor can be a form of mastery over extreme experiences. It also felt very risky in a way that I need as a novelist. I need to be taking risks. I need to have a sense that it's very possible that not everyone is going to like this. That actually motivates me in my art making. I'm not like trying to build consensus when I'm making art. So I wanted to depict a friendship between two survivors that was not based in like words like healing, and was not built around like tears or anything like that, but it was built around something else. You know, the way that these characters have metabolized their traumas is to make jokes about them, even as they're seriously struggling. You know.
Yeah. I'm just wondering, just because there's so many great one-liners between, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot like this real fast.
Yeah.
What was like your favorite one-liner between Jane and Vivian to just kind of give people a taste of like what?
Oh, it's very bad. It's very bad.
I don't know if you should do it at the Center for Fiction,
No,
but there's a couple of them. But like,
it's really bad. I started with Woody Allen, and now you're asking me this.
But I feel like this is the joke. Like you're like this comedian never existed, and yet it's in this book. Are you willing to tell that joke?
Yeah, sure. So my character, Vivian, her best friend, says when they're like super high, okay, she stands up and she's performing for her friend Vivian because they are in a protected environment. They're not at a reading. They're just like hanging out. And she stands up and she's like about to hit her friend with this joke, and she says, I must have been a really cute kid because I was molested by 2 different people. And then she adds on, wish I could Me Too them, but they're both dead.
It's
So that's
funny here. It's really funny in the book.
So drag me, y'all. Drag me in the Q&A. Just drag me by my weave.
This book got an incredibly good review in New York Magazine's Vulture, and the reviewer, Jamie Hood, she brings up what has been this year kind of a literary cultural moment that I wonder if we can talk about. You've already mentioned it, which is Peru Segal's New Yorker essay, The Case Against the Trauma Plot. And I'm just going to quote Jamie here, talking about even just reviewing something about trauma, never mind writing about it.
Yeah.
But Jamie wrote, to review a novel grappling with PTSD is to write in the shadow of Peru Segal's recent New Yorker essay, The Case Against the Trauma Plot, in which the critic suggests that trauma disorders have become contemporary narrative's de facto explanation for any problem. This kind of plot, Segal argues, flattens, distorts, reduces character to symptom, and in turn instructs and insists upon its moral authority. But, Jamie writes, Segal's manifesto leaves little room for self-reflexivity, for slippiness. She largely skirts the possibility that narratives about trauma could generate internal tension, that they could play with, resist, or remap their own conventions. And then Jamie goes on to talk about all the ways that you are able to do this, that you don't do what Segal claims that trauma plots do. And as you say, the trauma is largely elided in the story. The book takes place after the trauma, all in the present tense. Would you be willing to talk about trauma as a narrative device and how inevitably you've been forced to discuss your book maybe in light of the trauma plot?
Yeah, I think, I've said this before that when I read that essay, I didn't feel particularly implicated in it because I knew that I had not done any of the things that Peril doesn't like, which is like using trauma to explain away character, personality, character, quirk, trauma as kind of like a hokey device to just explain everything away. In my characters, Vivian works in a psychiatric hospital. And she works as an attorney trying to free people from forced institutionalization and drugging by the state. She's very suspicious of psychological diagnoses, like just in general, because she sees the way that they are racially deployed and strategically deployed against poor people of color. So she doesn't want anything to do with that biomedical conceptualization of illness. My characters are also so much more and so much bigger than what has happened to them. And if anything, my book is about the fact that violence cannot extinguish personality and it cannot flatten it. These are characters that will not be flattened. So I read the essay. I knew that my book, I knew that I was going to be asked about it, but I also didn't feel particularly implicated by it. I think the other thing that I'll say about my approach to writing about violence was I was reacting against different trauma plots than Segal is even talking about in that essay. So I was reacting against books written, like harrowing childhood books, which I didn't have any interest in writing. I didn't want to have graphic depictions of violence in my book. There were so many ghost girl books when I was growing up. Like there's a little dead girl and the reader is essentially reading the book to watch a child be raped and murdered. And I think that there are maybe some people who wanted that from my book. And I think there's been a little disappointment that there's not more child abuse in my book, which I think is a very interesting criticism. It's a strange, it's as we say, you're telling on yourself if that's your takeaway that you are going to publish on the internet. It's an interesting take. The other thing that I'll say about that essay that I haven't gotten a chance to say yet is I think that it's a very interesting essay in a lot of ways, but one thing that she does not talk about is the publishing industry's own complicity in limiting the scope of trauma narratives. And as a critic, she's part of that ecosystem. And she's actually been great about championing like Virginie Despentes' work, like Baiser Moi, which features two survivors of violence who go on a killing spree, and it's a really wonderful, fantastic book. But the kind of critical grousing is a little bit strange when as a critic, you have the ability and the capacity, and in fact, that's part of your mandate, to write about books that are doing different things with the trauma plot. But the problem is that so many of those books are published by small and independent presses, and then they don't get book coverage in criticism. So those books do exist. There are books that are doing very different things with the trauma plot, but the question is, like, do you cover them? And will big publishers buy those books? Or are big publishers demanding that people write a kind of trauma plot that will sell?
Yeah.
Because it's middlebrow.
Yeah. I mean, I found really interesting, for instance, the way that you weren't willing to capitulate to a lot of that. You know, that like the perpetrator doesn't get a name, gets only the violent man.
Yes.
So that person's, in the language, not centered.
Yes.
So there's all these sort of things that it subverted what I think the expectations were.
Yeah.
One thing, and then part of that was, I think also one of the expectations in a lot of books is that, that these stories will end with some sort of reconciliation or healing, like in so many of them. And one thing I thought your book was amazing in how it did was that it holds out the possibility that reconciliation or healing doesn't happen with other people. It holds out the possibility that cutting off one's family, cutting off the access to people who've hurt you is a morally possible and even potentially morally correct thing to do rather than some sort of reconciliation. And so the book allows it, some relationships can't be mended and sometimes healing's an individual act. When in the writing did you decide that you were going to let that be a possibility or let that be a way that Vivian might move?
Yeah, for a long time when I was writing the book, I was really influenced by character study novellas that are very short. Specifically, Anita Bruckner, an English writer, is one of my favorite all-time writers, and she wrote many very tight, like 150-page character studies, often about kind of the same character, a middle-aged woman who lives a life of rigid scrupulosity, and she tries to do something impetuous, like one little thing, and fails, and then just goes back to being super rigid and moral. And I wanted to write a book that was a character study of someone who was experiencing what I call post-traumatic consciousness, because I think rendering consciousness is what the novel does best, and I'm always thinking about, this medium that I'm working in. What does it do best? Okay, it does consciousness best. Well, I want to do like a post-trauma consciousness novel. And I did, so the early versions of the book were very, very interior, even more interior than the book we have now. It was 300 pages of a character experiencing hypervigilance and suspecting men of wanting to attack her, and she's agonizing over what snack to choose, and she's measuring herself, and that was it. And there were no other characters, and it was just 300 pages of that. And I realized about midway through writing the book that is, I love books like that, but it's really hard to do that for 300 pages. And someone who read the book was basically just like, this is like so cool, but like, what if something happened? And it was very gentle. It was a what if something happened, maybe that could be interesting if something happened. And so then there were just questions about like, who is her family and what does she do for a living and who are the other people in her world, right? Because other characters can make things happen, and like what social unit makes things happen more that you don't want, like more than the family, right? So then I started writing about the character's family, and when I got in there and started writing about the family, I was just like, I want my characters to talk about moral duties to family members that do you harm. It became like an obsession of mine. I was like, why haven't I seen this? Why haven't I seen, it was like my Bechdel test was like, can two women talk about moral issues? Because I don't see that. And in my life, in my personal life, when talking with friends, when you're talking about interpersonal issues, you are often talking about moral issues and ethical issues, and what do I owe to these people who have hurt me? And so I stage a conversation between my main characters, Vivian and Jane, where they are essentially asking this, Jane is asking this question from a perspective of moral philosophy because she's an academic, and she's like, Did you know that like philosophers, like there's different theories about what we owe to our families? And Vivian's like, no, I didn't know that. And they start to have this kind of dialogue. And I think as we see, as Vivian moves through the book, that's like a question that she's constantly thinking about. What do I owe these people? Who didn't give me enough, who didn't nurture me enough, and who allowed horrible things to happen to me, and who are still not giving me enough. What do I owe them? And we watch as she kind of resolves that question. And I think for her, she resolves it in some ways by flipping the question, like maybe by the end, she's just like, well, instead of asking what the adult child owes to the family, like what about what like the family owes to the survivor of the violence? And maybe what they owe her is to stay away.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's very the way it resolved, and no spoilers here, so I don't want to say too much, but the way that it happens, it really stuck with me for a while. It continues to, and in that too, I was like, well, if it's not family, if it's not resolution, where are the moments in which you get a kind of lifting? And one thing I noticed in this book a lot is music, which is interesting to read. You don't hear music when you're reading text, but that the effect of music is felt so much in this book. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, that's so spot on, because I felt like when I was writing the book, I found myself modulating and adjusting for tone. And I am definitely someone who believes that whatever I'm writing about, I just think I'm always going to have a balance between light and dark, and comedy and tragedy, and for me personally, music is like the only thing in life that I don't have to defend. It's the only art form that I have a very pure, unadulterated relationship to. And so I thought that the author's enthusiasm would just add some lightness and some brightness. And in how that manifests to the character, Vivian, she loves music, she's a music nerd, she's obsessed. And when she's dancing, singing, listening to music, those are moments where the reader gets some reprieve from the claustrophobia of her mind, because she's actually capable of presence when she is engaging with music in some way. You know, I would say music and then her friend Jane.
Yeah.
You know, those are moments where it's actual presence and not so much performance of self.
Yeah, one of like the sort of magic things about this book is that as a reader, I ended up feeling what she was feeling, and it was like moments like, yeah, totally, like, you know, when you're picking out your snack and or you're on the train, and there's sort of like, what snack should I get? Or on the train, there's a kind of hyper vigilance of like, who's around me, what are they doing, why are they doing it, and you start thinking, you know, the way that those thoughts moved, my thoughts started moving that way, and then in the same way, you had these ecstatic moments when the music came on, which actually feels like what happens when like the song comes on and like the, you know, like the moment hits, and you're light, you know, it's light, and it's kind of amazing that you were able to do that in text. And in the same way, I also, one of the things I thought that was where you really, like, you know, as you talk about the medium of fiction, another place I thought you were able to use fiction really well is that you allowed, I think you allowed Vivian to be wrong sometimes.
Yes.
But there wasn't like the authorial presence wasn't there. It was sort of like you just experienced the wrongness in all these different ways. Do you have like a way that you think about, you know, how fiction can be wrong in a way that like an essay can't exactly be wrong in what it's doing? Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, wow. The first thing that I thought of as you were speaking was the book Avas Man by Gail Jones, which features a black female protagonist that when I read that book, I had just never seen a character like this before, who is a black woman who kills a lover of hers in a horrific, gruesome, vengeful way, and then is asked multiple times, basically like why did you do that, and like how do you feel, and she refuses to answer the question. And I read that book and I was just like yes, like, you know, let's just have more like black women nihilist sociopaths, you know? And that's not my book and that's not my character, but I want that for us, you know? Like we deserve to be sociopaths. Like that is reparations, you know, like symbolic reparations, you know? So it's really important for me just to have characters who are allowed to be wrong and bad and stupid and dumb, and because that's what being a human being is. And if we are meant to only be on a pedestal, very perfect, having perfect thoughts all the time, you know, like my character, for instance, she's a feminist, but she's restricting her food intake and weighing herself and measuring herself. She has to be allowed. I mean, I felt very strongly that, particularly with that she just has to be allowed to do that. And it felt I felt very, self-righteous about her ability to have an eating disorder. I mean, she should get to have that. And we can talk as a society about whether, like, the tyranny of slenderness is a good thing. It's clearly not. But the extent to which she appears human-like has to involve hypocrisy and moral breaches. Otherwise, she's not fully human. She's not fully realized.
Yeah. That just kind of speaking about characters, can you do that? Another pleasure of this book for me, the lights are coming out. So actually I'm going to do this as a slightly different last question, since the lights come up. Roxane Gay closes all of her author interviews in the exact same way with what I think is a really great question, and so I'm going to steal it from her. A lot of times writing is an act of ego. You demand that your reader listen to you for hours. And I think that Roxane Gay's question is our chance as writers to justify that. So the question is, what do you like best about your own writing?
Oh, I love that. I love that question. I love the humor, which we've talked about. I love the thoughts. It was called Dark Thoughts for very many years, and I love those thoughts. I love them so much, and they're clunky and long-winded, and they are under the influence of THC for a lot of the book. But damn, I love those thoughts.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Thank
that.
you.
And we're going to open. Oh yeah. We're going to open it up to questions from the audience, which I think it also includes perhaps people online, but especially those of you who've come out in the rain.
As people are figuring out their questions, I have one question from our Zoom, or two questions actually, from Jeremy. One is art the best form of activism? And the other is, will there be a Spotify playlist for this novel? And as they're answering this question, people can line up right by the microphone and get ready to ask your questions.
So, hi, Jeremy. There is already a Spotify playlist. If you look on the Little Brown and Company Spotify page, I did make a playlist for this novel. The first song is Just a Girl by No Doubt. And I was just, obsessed with that being the first song on the playlist. In terms of activism, I am a lawyer. I think that art is very different from activism. And you get to have a lot more fun in art, and you don't have to be perfect, and art is not propaganda. So it's a little bit different than activism, because I'm not, in my book, there's no call to action in my book. I'm not asking anyone to do anything. But I am insisting on, I think my work has political import to me, at the very least, because of the characters that I'm choosing to depict, and the humanity that I am insisting on giving the characters in my book.
Hi.
Hi.
My name's Oliva. You mentioned that it took you like 7 or 8 years to write the book. Could you kind of talk about the process of dealing with the fact with recognizing that it was going to potentially take that long, or like getting discouraged from wanting to continue, slash like what kind of things kept you motivated, and like what pushed you to keep working on it and change things around?
That's a great series of questions. I mean, if I knew that it was going to take this long, I probably wouldn't have started. I thought that I was just going to be a lawyer and a writer, and that it was all going to be fine, and I would just, I don't know. This is what I thought. This is what I decided for myself. I mean, it took it took so long, you know, in part because the more that I read, the more that my taste changed, the more that my standards for what a novel is changed. You know, if I was out here wanting to do like a little book of fragments, then maybe I could have written this book in a year or two, you know. But as the world of the book grew, the craft challenge also grew, you know, because I was good at my thoughts. I was good at like having a character sit and think. But when she's in a room with someone else, how do you write that? I don't know. I had to figure that out. I had to figure out, like, how do you write a party scene? Mm-hmm. How do you write a wedding scene? You know, how do you write a scene on a psychiatric ward? How do you do that? That's what made it take a really long time. And what kept me going, I mean, friends, some of whom are here in this audience, friends kept me going, friends who are writers, and other books. You know, other books were a major comfort to me. And listening to podcasts. I probably, you know, I don't have an MFA, but I say that I received a podcast MFA. Because there is a podcast episode for every aspect of the writing process that can vault you into psychological crisis. You know, like, and I can tell you what they are, and maybe I will do so in a forthcoming listicle. So yeah, that's the answer. Thank you so much for the question.
Hi. Thank you both for being here. My name's Kyle.
Hey, Kyle.
So speaking of podcasts, on this week's Food for Thought, Tommy Pico, who blurbed the book, he mentioned that there was a moment in time where you kind of felt like you were going to give up on writing.
Yeah.
As a writer myself, I'm interested in how you navigated that and got back to it, and how it feels to have this book out now.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much, Kyle. And yes, Tommy, wow, I haven't listened to that episode yet. I'm so glad to hear that you blew up my spot. I mean, I think when I met Tommy, I had already given up on creative writing. When I met Tommy, I was training to be an academic. And so I was doing, it was kind of like a those who can't do teach kind of a situation, where basically what happened to me was, one of the things that happened to me, when I was in college, I took a creative writing class, and my writing was critiqued horribly, and I stopped writing for 6 years because the criticism was so bad and it was so stinging that and none of this was conscious, but I think I just kind of was like, maybe as a form of mastery, like instead of creating creative work, I will just be the critic who writes about the work. And I think that is a common path to literary criticism and scholarship. And luckily, I had friends like Tommy Pico who knew that actually I wanted to write and that I wanted to write fiction. And he started a literary zine that was very low stakes. It was called Birdsong Magazine. And we all, a group of friends and I all contributed to that zine. And we stapled and hand sewed it together. And I was able to write and put in there whatever juvenilia, whatever imperfect, potentially shameful, potentially embarrassing, just like not totally perfect thing that I wanted. And I wrote poems with dark jokes about child abuse, and I wrote short stories with dark jokes about child abuse, and I wrote essays with dark jokes about child abuse. And that really got me started in writing. So Tommy Pico basically created a safe environment for me to fail, which is what artists need. And I was terrified of failing, and I needed to kind of get over that. And he helped me profoundly. Yeah, thank you so much for that question. Hi.
Hi, I think my question is actually kind of related, but it's about the tension between, you talked about your commitment to taking risks in the book, and also, especially escalating over the time you were writing it, your commitment to like your standards and the rigor. And I just want to hear you talk about that tension between control of writing and letting go, and whether writing such a controlled character like Vivian like amplified that or allowed you to like go into her controlling. What was your experience of that tension?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to mind for me is shame. And I think Vivian is a character who she's very shame prone, I would say. And one way to deal with shame is through perfectionism. This idea that if you can just appear perfect, you know, like with the body stuff, you know, I think a lot of body stuff is about dignity. and you know, many folks who experience violence and abuse in their lives have issues with that fundamental question of bodily autonomy and bodily dignity. And so I knew that I wanted to depict, say, like her measuring herself and the rituals and the eating. I wanted to depict that, but I also felt that that would be so ugly to depict that, and that as the writer, I would lose some dignity by depicting this thing that we cannot depict or talk about. And so at times I would take that stuff out. I would take out the cellulite. Cellulite is a character in this book, okay? Because I was reading these books, these eating disorder novels, and there was no discussion of cellulite. And I was just like, you have to talk about the body if you are talking about like compulsive exercise, right? But sometimes I would take it out because I didn't wanna, because you read these books and there's no description of the actual body that's being rejected. And ultimately, I just thinking about cellulite, I was just kind of like, I have to let go. I cannot replicate the control in the writing, actually. Like maybe the only way to like deal with cellulite as a person is to write about cellulite. Right? And so actually like that's the whole thing with all the eating stuff. It's like you actually just have to just kind of like say what the fuck, and just let it go and write about it, and write about the dimples and the divots and the bulges, and just come to almost like a state of neutrality about that. And I think I did that probably with 10 other things in the book. Because I ultimately felt that I don't know, I just needed to be true and honest. Thank you so much. Beautiful question.
One more question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I know, Torrey, you mentioned the essay, The Case Against the Trauma Plot.
Yeah.
And when thinking about how, like, it almost took you, like, a decade to write Posttraumatic,
yeah.
I'm wondering how, like, since the cultural landscape has kind of shifted, like, the way that we talk about trauma, like, all the vocabulary that we're using and that we're kind of adapting to, I'm wondering how that's, like, that affected your writing process and, like, the way you viewed the characters and just their discussions and stuff.
Yeah, that's such a great question. The question is about how, because it took me almost a decade to write the book, And in that time, the way that we talk about trauma in our culture has changed. And so how was I kind of dealing with that? I mean, the first thing that I think of is the word trigger. And maybe I use it once in the book, but I feel like it was really sad to me what happened to that word and how it was kind of like co-opted, diluted, and is now like almost devoid of meaning. But I did things like mostly avoiding using a word like that. So I used the word activated instead because I wanted to capture what the character is experiencing without associating her with a term that has been kind of taken away from victims and survivors. It's not our word anymore. So yeah, I think that's how I would answer that. Like I think I had to develop new language while I was writing the book. And find a way, it's a delicate balance. Like I have that Me Too joke, and part of the thing of that is like, well, I do want the reader to understand that these characters are living in a kind of immediately post Me Too landscape, and that they are actively metabolizing that in the way that they talk to each other. But they're not tweeting about their traumas. That's not what these characters are doing. But they are watching other people do that, and they're commenting on it, but they're not the same as those people. I hope that answered your question. Great question.
All right, let's give him a big round of applause.